The Haunted Basement, Lily's Terrifying Fight for Escape. Chapter 1. The House of Whispers. Lily stood in the front yard, gazing up at the towering old house that would now be her home. The sky overhead was a dull gray, as if the clouds themselves were too afraid to let the sun fully shine on the house. It was the kind of building that seemed to belong in a different time. Its architecture a blend of sharp angles, dark wood, and creeping vines that had taken root in the cracks of its stone foundation. She shivered, but it wasn't the cold that made her feel uneasy. It was something else, something she couldn't quite name. Her parents bustled about, chatting excitedly about renovations, paint colors, and furniture arrangements. To them, this was a fresh start, a blank canvas for their new life in this quiet, unassuming suburb. But to Lily, the house didn't feel new. It felt old, tired, and waiting. As they crossed the threshold, a wave of cold air greeted them, much cooler than the brisk autumn outside. The interior was dim, with long, narrow hallways that stretched out like mazes leading to rooms hidden in the shadows. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet as they explored, their footsteps echoing hollowly in the empty space. Dust floated lazily in the light from the few windows, catching the beams and making the air itself seem thick, heavy. "Lily, why don't you go pick out your room?" her mother called from the kitchen, where she and her father were already discussing where to place the new dining table. Lily nodded, her eyes still drawn to the strange details of the house. The wallpaper was peeling in places, revealing faded patterns beneath layers of grime, and the ceiling had patches of discoloration, as if time had been trying to reclaim the place for itself. There was a peculiar smell too, not quite mildew, but something musty and forgotten, like old books left untouched for decades. She climbed the winding staircase to the second floor, her hand trailing along the ornate wooden banister. Each step made the wood groan beneath her weight, as though the house was protesting her presence. The upstairs hallway was long and narrow, with several doors leading to different rooms. Most of them were closed, but one door stood slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of what would become her bedroom. Pushing it open, she was met with a modest space, its single window overlooking the overgrown backyard. A large oak tree stood sentinel outside, its branches stretching toward the window, like fingers reaching for something out of reach. The room was unfurnished, save for a heavy wardrobe pushed against the far wall. Lily hesitated, feeling a strange tug of war within her, a sense of belonging mixed with an inexplicable fear. She turned away from the window and glanced around. The room seemed ordinary enough, but there was something about the house, something unspoken, that pressed against her senses. It was almost as if the walls themselves were watching her, waiting for her to notice something hidden just beneath the surface. As she walked back down the stairs, the house seemed to shift ever so slightly. The air grew thicker, and Lily paused mid-step, straining her ears. For a moment, she thought she heard something, a faint whisper, barely audible, like the wind brushing through leaves. She shook her head. It was probably just the old house settling. Still, the sound lingered in her mind like a half-forgotten dream. Curiosity, however, always had a way of getting the better of her. After all, she had spent most of her life searching for hidden corners, secret doors, and undiscovered paths wherever she went. Every tree could have a hollow. Every crack in the sidewalk might lead to another world, at least in her imagination. So it was no surprise that she found herself drawn to the basement door. The basement was located in a narrow hallway behind the kitchen, almost tucked away as if the house itself had tried to hide it. The door was different from the others. It was old, much older than the rest of the house. Its wood was dark and heavy, worn with age, and the brass handle was tarnished, as though it hadn't been touched in years. Lily stood in front of it, her hand hovering over the handle. A strange sensation washed over her, something between fear and excitement, like standing on the edge of a cliff and daring to look down. She could feel the pulse of the house here, as if the walls around the door were holding their breath, waiting for her to make the first move. "What are you doing down here, sweetheart?" Her father's voice broke the spell, and she jumped, spinning around to face him. "I was just looking around," she replied, a little embarrassed. She could see her father's puzzled expression as he glanced at the basement door, then shrugged. "Nothing down there but some storage space. We'll put some of the boxes down later. Why don't you come help us unpack?" Lily nodded, but as they walked back to the living room, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to that door than her father realized. There was something behind it, something old, something that had been waiting. That night, as the house settled into the quiet rhythm of evening, Lily lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The shadows danced across the walls in strange, shifting patterns. The wind outside rattled the windows softly, and every now and then she heard a faint creak or groan from the old floorboards below. Her parents had already fallen asleep. The house plunged into a deep stillness. But Lily couldn't sleep. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the basement door, to the strange feeling it had given her. It was like an itch she couldn't scratch, a question that had no answer. Then, in the quiet of the night, she heard it, a slow, deliberate creak. She sat up in bed, her heart thudding in her chest. The sound had come from downstairs. She held her breath, listening intently. Another creak, followed by a soft groan, like wood bending under pressure. It was the door. Lily slipped out of bed and tiptoed to her bedroom door, peeking out into the dark hallway. The house was still, but the sound came again, more distinct this time. The unmistakable sound of the basement door moving, as if it was opening on its own. For a long moment, she stood frozen in the doorway, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. But curiosity gnawed at her, urging her forward. Slowly, she crept down the stairs, careful to avoid the creaky steps, her heart pounding in her ears. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw it. The basement door was ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling out from the crack. It hadn't been opened before. Lily stood there, staring at the door, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The house was silent, but she could feel something watching her from the other side of that door, something waiting. And then, just as she was about to turn and run back to her room, the door creaked open a little wider. Chapter 2. The Door to Nowhere. Lily stood frozen at the top of the basement stairs, her eyes locked on the basement door. The heavy wood still hung ajar, the darkness behind it beckoning like an invitation, a quiet dare. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to retreat, to run back to the safety of her bedroom and pretend none of this had happened. But something deep inside, a curiosity she couldn't ignore, urged her forward. The house above her was still and silent, her parents asleep, unaware of what lay beneath them. With a steadying breath, Lily stepped lightly onto the first stair, her fingers brushing against the cool wooden railing. She descended slowly, each step feeling like a descent into something unknown, something waiting. The air grew cooler the closer she got to the basement door, almost unnaturally so, like stepping into the heart of a shadow. Her pulse quickened as she reached the bottom of the stairs and stood before the door. From here, it seemed different, heavier, darker, more ominous than it had been earlier in the day. The faint, unsettling whisper she had heard before now echoed in the silence around her, like a forgotten breath lingering on the air. The hairs on her arms prickled as she reached out, her fingers trembling as they wrapped around the brass handle. The door had been locked. She was sure of it. Yet now, it was open, the sliver of darkness between its frame growing wider with each passing second. She hesitated, her mind wrestling between fear and curiosity. The sensible part of her knew she should walk away, close the door and forget about it. But something else, something deeper, pushed her forward. With a trembling hand, Lily nudged the door open, its hinges groaning as if in protest. Beyond the threshold, instead of the familiar cluttered basement she had expected, there was something else entirely. It was a hallway, long, narrow, and impossibly dark. The walls seemed to shimmer in the faint light spilling in from the basement, their surface shifting, almost alive. It was as though the very fabric of the space was breathing, the walls expanding and contracting in a slow, rhythmic pulse. Cold air seeped from the hallway, wrapping around her like icy fingers, sending shivers down her spine. The cold here was different, a bone-deep chill that felt not just physical but somehow otherworldly, seeping into her very soul. Lily stepped forward cautiously, her breath hanging in the air like mist as she crossed the threshold into the hallway. The basement behind her seemed to recede into the distance, swallowed by the shadows as though the door led not to a room, but to another realm entirely. She glanced over her shoulder, her stomach tightening at how quickly the real world seemed to be fading away. The familiar clutter of boxes, old furniture, and the faint smell of dust and mold were gone, replaced by the deep, unnatural stillness of this new place. The walls of the hallway loomed over her, close and suffocating. They weren't made of wood or stone, but something else, something softer and slicker, like the skin of some great slumbering beast. As she walked farther, the walls seemed to narrow, closing in on her as if trying to swallow her whole. Lily's heart raced, her breathing growing shallow as her footfalls echoed in the eerie silence. Every few steps, the air would shift. First a cold breeze, then a low, almost imperceptible hum, like the distant drone of something far beneath the earth. The hallway stretched on, seemingly without end, disappearing into a darkness so thick and complete that it felt like a living thing. The farther she walked, the more disorienting it became. It was as if reality itself was bending, warping under some unseen force, twisting the air around her into something foreign and unnatural. Lily's senses dulled as the familiar world slipped further away. Time lost its meaning here. Had she been walking for minutes? Hours? It was impossible to tell. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the very air was thickening, resisting her movement. Yet something compelled her forward, a pull she couldn't explain. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, but her legs carried her deeper into the hallway, the unseen force drawing her in. And then she saw them. At first, it was just a flicker at the edge of her vision, barely there. But as she moved farther into the hallway, the flickers became more pronounced. Shadows shifting along the walls, twisting and dancing in the corner of her eye. They weren't cast by any light source she could see. They simply existed, flickering and flitting along the walls as if alive. Lily paused, her heart hammering in her chest as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The shadows seemed to be watching her, waiting for her to notice them fully. She reached out, her hand brushing against the pulsating wall. It felt cold and smooth, like the surface of a frozen river, and yet alive. A faint whisper echoed through the hallway, soft but unmistakable, sending a shiver down her spine. It was her name. Lily. The voice was barely more than a breath, but it filled the space around her, curling through the air like smoke. She froze, every muscle in her body tensing as she strained to hear it again. But the whisper had vanished, leaving only the oppressive silence in its wake. Her mind raced. Who had called her name? There was no one here, at least no one she could see. Yet the voice had felt close, almost intimate, like it had come from right behind her. She turned slowly, half expecting to see a figure standing in the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the endless hallway stretching out behind her, the way back to the basement swallowed by darkness. The urge to run gripped her, but before she could act, the door behind her slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the hallway, reverberating off the pulsating walls, and Lily's heart leapt into her throat. She spun around, her hands flying to the door, but it was too late. The heavy, ancient wood had sealed itself, trapping her in the hallway. She pulled at the handle, her hands shaking, but it wouldn't budge. Panic welled up inside her, her breath coming in shallow, desperate gasps as she pounded on the door. But it didn't open. The hallway had her now, and there was no way back. Lily pressed her ear to the door, listening for any sound from the basement, but all she could hear was her own ragged breathing. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing thicker, more oppressive, as the reality of her situation sank in. She was trapped, alone in this strange, otherworldly space with no idea how to escape. And then, in the suffocating silence, the whisper returned. Lily. The voice was louder this time, closer, and it was no longer a mere breath. It was tangible, filling the hallway with a presence that made her skin crawl. Chapter 3. Echoes of the Forgotten. Lily's pulse hammered in her ears as the whisper faded into the cold, suffocating air of the hallway. Her eyes darted in every direction, scanning the distorted space for signs of movement, for anything that resembled an exit. But all she could see were the same pulsating walls that seemed to breathe with a life of their own. The dark, oppressive silence stretched on, broken only by the faint, echoing sound of her own heartbeat. Her fingers traced the sealed door behind her, the one that had shut her in this nightmare, but it remained unyielding, as cold and immovable as stone. Swallowing hard, she took a step forward, deeper into the hallway. The air here was thick, almost viscous, and every breath she took felt heavier, as if the atmosphere itself were pressing down on her, trying to hold her in place. The ground beneath her feet rippled like liquid, unstable, shifting with each tentative step she took. She had no choice but to keep moving. Standing still only made the shadows feel closer, the whispers louder, more insistent. They curled through the air like smoke, carrying faint echoes of voices that sounded almost human, but weren't. As she ventured further, the flickering shadows danced along the walls, mocking her, shifting in ways that defied logic. Lily kept her gaze forward, though her heart pounded harder with every step, and her legs trembled beneath her. The hallway twisted and turned, no longer resembling any place grounded in reality. The farther she walked, the more the world seemed to unravel around her, transforming into something warped, unfamiliar. The walls no longer pulsed, but instead stretched and contracted as though they were alive and suffocating. Everything felt wrong. Lily glanced at the ceiling. It was too high, as if the space had expanded in impossible ways. The roof of the hallway, so distant it seemed like the sky, dark and filled with swirling shadows. She blinked, her mind unable to comprehend the impossible sight. The furniture, old, mismatched pieces she vaguely recognized from their living room, floated above her head, suspended in mid-air as if gravity had lost its hold. A worn armchair drifted slowly past her, tilting slightly before disappearing into the darkness beyond. Her breath came in short gasps, her feet unsure of the ground beneath them. The floor rippled and shimmered like water, and with every step it shifted, as if it might collapse under her at any moment. She felt like she was walking on a fragile surface, one that could give way and swallow her whole. And then there were the voices. At first, they were faint, like murmurs carried on the wind. But as Lily ventured deeper, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. She could hear fragments of conversations, names, pleas, desperate, hopeless cries for help. The words floated through the air, bouncing off the walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Please, don't leave me. I didn't mean to. The door won't let me out." Lily shivered, her skin crawling as she realized what they were. These voices belonged to people who had been trapped here, just like her. But unlike her, they hadn't found a way out. They were the echoes of those who had once lived in the house, remnants of lives lost to this cursed dimension. Trapped between life and death, their souls had been swallowed by the darkness, their pain lingering in the walls, in the air, in every corner of this twisted place. She paused, trying to listen closely to the voices. They seemed to carry the weight of years, decades, maybe even centuries, of suffering. It was as if time didn't exist here, the voices layered one on top of the other, overlapping in a cacophony of despair. Each whisper revealed a sliver of the house's dark past, its grim history unfurling before her like a horror too vast to comprehend. One voice stood out from the rest, louder, clearer. It belonged to a man, his tone filled with regret. "I should have never opened the door," he whispered, his voice hollow. "It doesn't let you leave. Not unless you give it something." A chill ran down Lily's spine. Her mind spun, trying to make sense of what he meant. But before she could dwell on it, movement in the shadows caught her eye. A figure, a man, flickered into view. His outline was faint, translucent, like a photograph fading from existence. He hovered just beyond her reach, his face twisted in anguish. His clothes were old-fashioned, from a time long past, and his eyes were hollow, vacant. Lily's heart skipped a beat as she realized he wasn't truly alive. He was an echo, a ghost of the man who had spoken those words. He didn't seem to notice her, or if he did, he didn't acknowledge her presence. He moved slowly as if trapped in a loop, repeating the same actions over and over, doomed to relive his torment for eternity. Lily backed away from him, her breath hitching in her throat. Suddenly, the hallway twisted again, warping as if the very walls were trying to close in on her. The shadows grew thicker, darker, and Lily felt a deep sense of dread settle over her. Something was watching her. She could feel its presence, something malevolent, something hungry. The air grew colder, the walls tightening like the grip of some unseen force. And then she saw her. An old woman emerged from the darkness, her form flickering like the others, but there was something more substantial about her presence. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes, deep and hollow, locked onto Lily with a gaze that chilled her to the core. She was more than just an echo. She was something else entirely, something that had lingered here for far too long. The woman moved toward her with an unsettling grace, her feet barely touching the ground. Her presence filled the hallway, oppressive and overwhelming. Lily stepped back, but there was nowhere to go. The old woman's lips parted, and her voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. "The door," she whispered, her voice raspy and filled with the weight of years of suffering. "It never lets you leave." Lily's heart thudded in her chest. The woman's gaze bore into her, as if she could see straight through her soul. "Unless," the old woman continued, her voice growing quieter, darker, "unless you give it something, or someone." Lily felt the weight of those words settle over her, heavy and suffocating. The shadows around her seemed to shift, as if responding to the woman's words, closing in on her. Chapter 4. Bargaining with Shadows. The further Lily ventured, the more the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred. The ground shifted beneath her like sand, and the air grew heavier, as if the dimension itself was tightening its grip. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing, the weight of the old woman's words echoing in her ears. "The door never lets you leave unless you give it something, or someone." She tried to push those thoughts away, refusing to let them sink in. There had to be another way. There had to be. But as she pressed on, the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before her, warping into twisted shapes that defied all logic. The pulsating walls closed in, then expanded out, as though the house itself was breathing, alive in its malevolent hunger. The flickering shadows began to gather, no longer just whispers but shapes, forms that watched her with glowing eyes from the corners of the twisted dimension. They weren't just echoes anymore. They were something more, something sinister, feeding off her growing fear. Their presence loomed large, shifting and writhing as if waiting for her next move, as if they were aware that she was getting closer to the heart of their prison. Ahead, the hallway opened into a vast chamber, larger than any space that could possibly exist within the confines of the house. The walls disappeared into an endless void, and the ceiling arched impossibly high, swallowed by darkness. In the center of the chamber stood a figure, more shadow than substance, towering and formless, yet unmistakably present. Lily's steps faltered. Her instincts screamed for her to turn back, but there was no other path, no escape. The figure, the keeper, seemed to be made entirely of darkness, its form shifting and undulating like smoke. Its glowing eyes, two orbs of fiery red, fixed on her, burning with an otherworldly intensity. They were ancient, filled with hunger, and they seemed to pierce straight into her soul. Lily's legs trembled as she stood frozen, her eyes locked on the monstrous entity before her. The chamber was utterly silent, save for the faint, rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Time stretched endlessly in that eerie quiet, every second a suffocating eternity. Finally, the silence was broken. "You have come far, child." The keeper's voice slithered through the darkness, deep and resonant, as if it came from the shadows themselves. It wasn't quite human, too cold, too detached, carrying an ancient malice that sent shivers down her spine. Few make it this far. Lily swallowed hard, her throat dry. She didn't respond, her mind racing, trying to process the terror standing before her. The figure loomed over her, shifting like the very fabric of this twisted dimension. "The house, it brought you here," the keeper continued, its voice curling through the air like smoke. "It is a bridge, a gate between worlds, but it needs sustenance to remain open. Those who find the door, those who are curious enough, they become the offering." Lily's heart sank, cold realization seeping into her bones. She had stumbled into something far worse than she had imagined. The house was more than cursed. It was a portal to this nightmare, and she had become its prey. Her body tensed, but she forced herself to remain calm, even as her mind screamed in terror. "You were not the first," the keeper's voice continued, each word dripping with malice. "And you will not be the last. This place feeds off your kind, off your fear, your souls. You are the fuel that keeps this dimension alive." The figure took a step toward her, its massive form stretching impossibly wide. Shadows gathered at its feet, swirling like dark smoke, and the cold air thickened, pressing down on her chest. Lily's heart raced, but her feet remained rooted to the ground. "I can offer you a choice," the keeper said, its glowing eyes narrowing as it leaned closer. "You may leave. You may return to your world." Lily blinked, her breath catching in her throat. Could it be that simple? Was this nightmare finally offering her a way out? But the voice dropped lower, colder. "There is a price." A chill ran down her spine as the shadows around the keeper swirled more violently, as if responding to the tension in the air. The keeper's eyes bored into hers, unblinking. "You must bring another in your place, a soul to take yours. If you do, the door will open for you, and you will be free." Lily recoiled, her stomach twisting in disgust. The thought was horrifying, vile. She had seen what this place did to people. Their trapped, tortured souls wandering endlessly, their voices pleading for escape. And now the keeper was offering her the same fate for someone else, someone innocent. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I won't do it." The keeper remained still, its eyes burning brighter as if amused by her defiance. "You will not leave without paying the toll, child. The door does not let you go so easily. Either you bring me another, or you will stay." Lily's chest tightened, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Could she even do such a thing? Could she live with herself, knowing she had condemned someone else to this horror? Her mind reeled, searching for another solution, but there was none. The keeper was unyielding, and the door was its prisoner. There was no escape unless she made the trade. "I can't," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't do that to someone." The keeper's form shifted, its outline growing darker, more menacing. The shadows around it seemed to throb with the intensity of its power. "Then you will stay." Before Lily could react, the world around her began to warp, the chamber twisting and shifting as if reality itself was unraveling. The walls closed in, the ground beneath her feet rippling violently. The shadows thickened, coiling around her legs, pulling her down, deeper into the darkness. She gasped, trying to free herself, but the more she struggled, the tighter the shadow's grip became. "You will be part of this place now," the keeper's voice boomed, reverberating through the air like a storm. "Just like the others." "No!" Lily screamed, her heart pounding as she fought against the encroaching darkness. She clawed at the air, desperate to hold on to something, anything, but there was nothing but the crushing cold of the dimension closing in around her. The shadows pulled harder, wrapping around her body, dragging her deeper into the floor. The air became thick, suffocating, and her vision blurred as the cold seeped into her bones. She could feel the weight of the house's curse pressing down on her, pulling her into its depths. As her consciousness began to slip, she heard the keeper's voice, faint and distant, whispering in the darkness. "You should have taken the bargain." The world collapsed around her. Chapter 5: The Mirror of Fear. The shadows dissolved, and suddenly Lily found herself standing alone in a vast, empty void. Everything was silent. No whispers, no flickering lights, no ominous presence looming over her, just an unsettling stillness. The ground beneath her feet felt smooth and cold, stretching out in all directions like an endless, flat plain of darkness. But the calmness was deceptive. It wasn't long before the darkness began to stir. Shapes formed in the distance, twisting and morphing into familiar figures. Lily's breath caught in her throat as she saw her family, her parents, emerging from the void. They were walking toward her, but something was off. Their movements were stiff, unnatural, like puppets being pulled on strings. "Mom?" Lily called, her voice trembling with hope and confusion. "Dad?" But as they drew closer, she saw their faces. Her mother's eyes were cold, distant, devoid of warmth. Her father's mouth twisted into a sneer, the kind of expression she had never seen him wear before. Their features were familiar, but warped, twisted with malice. "You shouldn't have come here," her mother said, her voice flat and unfeeling. "We've moved on, Lily." Her father nodded, his voice echoing in the void. "We've forgotten about you. You were nothing but a burden." Lily's stomach lurched. The words cut deep, stabbing into the very heart of her fears. She had always been scared of losing them, of being left behind. Now, that fear was manifesting before her, the cruel words coming from the very people she loved most. "No," Lily whispered, shaking her head. "You wouldn't say that. This isn't real." But the figures stepped closer, towering over her now, their eyes glowing with a strange, menacing light. "You're alone, Lily," her mother said coldly, her voice dripping with cruelty. "We don't want you." Tears welled up in Lily's eyes. Her heart pounded in her chest, and a wave of panic swept over her. She backed away, her mind racing, trying to remind herself that this couldn't be true. But the images were so real, so visceral, that they clung to her deepest insecurities. Her worst nightmares had always been about losing her family, about being forgotten. As the twisted figures of her parents advanced, the void around her shifted and warped. The flat plane of darkness became a fractured landscape, filled with floating mirrors that reflected the distorted versions of her family back at her. In each mirror, they appeared even more grotesque, their faces twisted with contempt, their words laced with venom. "Why would we want you?" The reflection of her father sneered. "You were never enough. You're weak," her mother's reflection added, her voice echoing around Lily like a chorus of judgment. "You couldn't even protect yourself, let alone us." Lily clenched her fists, her heart pounding harder. Every word echoed her own worst thoughts, the fears she had buried deep inside. She had always felt small, powerless, especially when she moved into the strange house. But now those feelings were overwhelming her, dragging her deeper into despair. Her parents. No, the illusions of her parents stepped closer, their shadows stretching long and ominous. The mirrors surrounding her seemed to multiply, each one reflecting a different version of her fears. Images of her family walking away, her friends disappearing, her home crumbling into dust, leaving her stranded and alone. "You don't belong here," the reflections chanted in unison, their voices rising in a twisted chorus. "You'll never escape." Lily's breath came in shallow, panicked gasps, her heart racing as she spun around, looking for a way out. But no matter which way she turned, the mirrors loomed over her, their cruel reflections growing more distorted, more menacing. The faces became hollowed, monstrous versions of her loved ones, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. In the center of the void, a new mirror appeared. Larger than the others, it shimmered with a strange, dark energy. As Lily approached it, she saw not her family, but herself, pale, frightened, and small. The reflection sneered back at her, its lips curling into a cruel smile. "You'll never be free?" The reflection hissed, its voice an eerie mimicry of her own. "You'll never be enough." Lily's body trembled, the weight of her own insecurities pressing down on her like a suffocating force. For a moment, she felt as though she might collapse under the pressure, lost in the twisted reality that had been created by her fears. But deep inside, something stirred, a flicker of defiance. "This isn't real," she reminded herself. "It's a trap. The Keeper was behind this. This nightmarish dimension fed on fear, and it was using her own mind against her, weaving illusions to keep her trapped. If she gave into the terror, she would never escape. She would become just another echo, lost to the house's dark history like the others before her. "No," Lily said softly, her voice trembling but resolute. "You're not real." The reflection in the mirror scowled, its face twisting in anger. "You can't run from the truth." Lily straightened, taking a deep breath as she squared her shoulders. "This isn't the truth," she said, her voice growing stronger. "It's my fear." The reflection began to flicker, its form distorting like a glitch in a broken video. The other mirrors around her cracked, their surfaces shattering as the twisted images inside them screamed and writhed, trying to hold on to her. But Lily refused to look away. She knew now that the power this place held over her was built on terror, and she wouldn't let it control her. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice firm, though her heart still raced. "You're just a lie." The void trembled, the ground beneath her feet rippling like water. The reflection in the central mirror snarled, its face warping grotesquely as it struggled to maintain its hold on her. But the more Lily pushed back, the weaker the illusion became. The mirrors shattered one by one, the broken shards dissolving into the air as the world around her began to unravel. The twisted forms of her parents faded, their cruel words turning into faint whispers that were soon swallowed by the darkness. The large mirror cracked, its surface splitting down the center as the reflection of Lily dissolved into a cloud of dark mist. The void was collapsing. The walls of the dimension warped and buckled as the shadows writhed and thrashed, unable to maintain their grip. The Keeper's power was faltering, and the illusion it had created was crumbling. In the distance, Lily saw it, the door. The same old heavy door that had led her into this nightmare. It stood there, glowing faintly, a small beacon of hope amidst the swirling chaos. But the keeper's voice boomed from the darkness, echoing through the collapsing void. "You cannot escape, you belong to me." Lily hesitated for only a second, then ran. She sprinted toward the door, her feet pounding against the ground as the world around her tore itself apart. The shadows clawed at her heels, trying to drag her back, but she refused to stop. As she reached the door, her hands stretched out, fingers brushing against the cold surface. With one final burst of determination, she pulled it open and stepped through. The last thing she heard as she left the collapsing dimension behind was the furious roar of the Keeper, its rage echoing in the void. And then, everything went silent. Chapter 6. The Price of Freedom. Lily stumbled through the door, breathless, heart still hammering in her chest. For a moment, everything was quiet. The oppressive darkness, the mirrors, the taunting reflections, all of it was gone. She found herself back in the hallway of the old house, the familiar, dusty smell of age surrounding her. The wooden floor creaked beneath her feet as she tried to steady herself, but she knew the stillness was temporary. The Keeper was still here. From the shadows at the far end of the hallway, it emerged, its presence a suffocating weight on the air. No longer hidden in the recesses of the dimension, it was fully visible now. A towering figure of darkness with glowing, malevolent eyes. Its form was ever-shifting, like smoke trapped in the shape of a man, with long, twisted limbs that stretched out as though trying to grasp everything around it. "You think you can run?" The Keeper's voice boomed, reverberating through the very bones of the house. The walls groaned as though they were alive, warping and twisting in response to its presence. "This is my world. You cannot escape me." Lily stood her ground, her legs shaking but her mind sharp. She had seen through the illusions now. The terror that had nearly consumed her in the other dimension was just that, fear, nothing more. And fear was the Keeper's greatest weapon, but it couldn't touch her unless she let it. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," Lily said, her voice quivering at first, but growing stronger with each word. She stepped forward, forcing herself to meet the Keeper's gaze. "You have no power over me." The house began to tremble. The once solid walls rippled like water, distorting as though the entire structure was coming undone. The floorboards buckled and cracked beneath her feet, the wood warping and splintering. The ceiling twisted unnaturally, as if the house itself was caught in a storm, struggling to maintain its shape. The Keeper's eyes narrowed, its form flickering and distorting as it loomed closer. "I have claimed hundreds of souls. They all feared me, as you will." But Lily didn't flinch. She could feel the fear clawing at the edges of her mind, trying to worm its way back in, but she refused to give it power. She remembered the echoes, the trapped souls she had encountered, those who had succumbed to their fears and lost themselves in this place. She wouldn't become one of them. "No," she said firmly, "I won't let you control me." As the words left her lips, something shifted. The very fabric of the house seemed to buckle, as if the Keeper's hold over it was weakening. The walls shuddered, cracking like brittle glass, and the floor beneath her feet seemed to ripple, no longer solid. The Keeper recoiled, its form dimming as the shadows around it thinned. "You cannot defy me," it hissed, its voice now filled with fury and desperation. "This house is my domain. You are mine." The ground beneath her began to shake violently, the floorboards splitting and curling upward like jagged teeth. But even as the house seemed to tear itself apart, Lily remained still. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment and centered herself. She knew what she had to do. Fear was the key. The Keeper fed on it, used it to control this dimension, to trap its victims in a cycle of torment. But fear was only as powerful as she allowed it to be. When she opened her eyes again, the shadows had receded further. The Keeper now barely visible, its form flickering and fading. The glow in its eyes dimmed as it snarled in frustration, unable to maintain its grip on reality. "You're nothing but a manifestation of fear," Lily said softly, stepping closer to the entity. "Without that, you're powerless." The walls of the house began to collapse inward, pieces of the ceiling raining down in chunks, and yet Lily felt calm. She had broken free of the illusion, and with each step she took toward the Keeper, The house crumbled more, the weight of its dark history unraveling around her. "You think you can defeat me?" the keeper rasped, its voice weakening. "I am eternal. I have claimed this place for centuries." But Lily didn't stop. She stood directly in front of the entity now, close enough to feel the coldness of its form, the hollow emptiness it radiated. "You only exist because people are afraid of you," she whispered. "But I'm not afraid anymore." The keeper let out a howl of rage, its form flickering wildly, the last of its power slipping away. The house convulsed, the floor beneath Lily's feet turning to dust, the walls bending and twisting in unnatural ways. The entire structure was collapsing, as if the dimension itself could no longer hold together without the fear that had sustained it for so long. Then in an instant, the keeper vanished, gone. The shadows that had clung to the walls like creeping vines dissolved, and the violent trembling of the house stopped. The air was still, the oppressive weight that had suffocated her moments before now lifted. But it wasn't over. As Lily took a step back, catching her breath, a door appeared in the middle of the room, the same door she had passed through to enter the nightmare. Its wooden surface was polished, almost inviting, but she knew better than to trust its appearance. This door was the only way out. It had always been. But as she reached for the handle, the air grew thick again. The keeper's voice returned, not in a roar, but a soft, sinister whisper. "You can leave, but the price is forgetting. Every memory of what happened here, every piece of the truth, gone." Lily froze, her hand hovering just above the door. Forgetting? That would mean losing everything she had learned about the house, the trapped souls, and the keeper itself. She would walk away as though none of this had ever happened. The house would remain, waiting for the next victim, for the next person to stumble upon its dark secrets and be pulled into the same nightmare. "Or," the voice continued, "you could stay, become part of this place, protect others from making the same mistake. It's your choice." Lily's heart pounded in her chest as the weight of the decision settled over her. She could escape, return to her life, and never remember the horrors she had faced. But what if someone else came here? What if they weren't strong enough to face the keeper? They could be lost forever, just like the others. The thought of staying, of being trapped in this place for eternity, made her stomach twist. But the idea of abandoning future victims to the same fate was just as unbearable. She stood there for what felt like hours, her hand still inches from the door, her mind racing. In the end, she made her decision. With a deep breath, she gripped the handle and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a blinding light beyond. She stepped forward, the warmth of the outside world washing over her. But as she crossed the threshold, the memories began to slip away, like sand slipping through her fingers. The keeper, the house, the echoes of the souls, it all faded, disappearing into the fog of her mind. The door closed behind her with a soft click, but in the darkness of the basement, the house remained, silent, waiting. And from deep within the shadows, a faint whisper echoed once more, ready for the next soul to stumble upon its cursed door.